Assalamu alaikum. This is a heavy session, and so one thing I always do when I talk about mental health in a big audience is I ask the audience to engage in a little exercise, because you're going to hear stuff that's kind of heavy, and so before you get into the heaviness, there needs to be like a release. So at the count of 3, I'm going to ask you all to laugh as loud as you possibly can. All right? It better be louder than that, right? Ready? 1, 2, 3. Good, you made me laugh. That's good. That's good. All right. So we're talking about mental health, right? We're talking about mental health, and I'm going to talk briefly about the intersection of Islam and mental health, and then I'm going to talk specifically about mental health as we understand it today in the little bit of time that we have, and we'll make sure that we have enough time in the end for questions. So mental health, when we talk about mental health is the optimal state of being that a person can have in this realm of their existence as a human being. So when we talk about physical health, talk about spiritual health, then we have mental health. So mental health itself is something that, mental health is different than mental illness. This is what I want you to understand just from the inception, right? Some people say, well, that person, we all have mental health. We all strive to have optimal mental health. What does that mean? Some of the literature that you find today, they found a nice way to kind of describe what does mental health mean, and they use what they call the 4 A's of mental health. And I wish we had a projector so we could show this to you, but we'll try to convey it verbally. So the 4 A's of mental health. Number 1, that somebody has agency. A person in their individual lives, they have agency, which means they have the ability to manage life's affairs, right? And to fulfill the responsibilities that they have in whatever roles that they serve in life. So that's number 1. Number 2, the second A is somebody who has a good sense of attachment, meaning they have healthy and meaningful relationships with other people. People who have poor mental health struggle in their relationships. Number 3, that a person has aspiration, right? That they have a motivation, and they have the ability and the desire and to grow and to learn from life and its experiences and move forward in life based upon those dreams and hopes that they have. And number 4, that a person has autonomy, meaning they have the ability to be an independent person that has their own self-determination. You have the ability to move forward in your life. Us as Muslims, our independence is not an independence devoid of the community. It's all of us together. When we make dua, we say, Ihdina as-sirata mustaqim. Guide us, O Allah, all together on the straight path. So when we talk about autonomy as Muslims, we're not talking about an independence that's stripped outside of our context. So these are the 4 A's, the agency, attachment, aspiration, and autonomy. So somebody who is well functioning in all of those realms has good mental health. But then you have the other end of the coin, which is mental illness. And mental illness has a number of subset of illnesses that fall underneath it. And they can be referred to in different ways, and none of them should be seen as a negative. So when if somebody says somebody has a mental health condition, that's not a negative term. We shouldn't take that as a negative term, and I'll talk about this in a minute. Or a mental health disorder, or a mental health illness, a mental illness. Those are not negative terms. Mental illness is like any other illness. Somebody who has any variety of physical illnesses, well, somebody can also have any number of different types of mental illness. So it's an illness just like an illness as it relates to the physical reality of who we are. It's not caused by a lack of faith or a weak moral character. Although, and we will talk about this inshallah, spirituality, for somebody to be strong in their deen, can give them more capacity to deal with life's difficulties and can have a positive effect in their ability to cope with their mental illness. But in and of itself, when somebody is depressed, when somebody is anxious and so forth, and they may reach clinical levels of those particular realities, that doesn't mean that that is a person who has poor iman and poor mental health and so forth. Who can think of an example from the Quran of somebody who struggled in some sort of way, and that, we're not putting, we're not diagnosing the people that are mentioned in the Quran with anything, but we're talking about certain human conditions that they faced based on the difficulties that they had in life. Give an example, just a name. I'm sorry? Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam, he went through tremendous ups and downs. Who else? I'm sorry? Sayyida Aisha? Sayyida Aisha, there's some reference that's made to her as it regards to hadithatul ifk, right? When she was blamed of something that she was completely, had nothing to do with. Who else? Sayyidina Ayyub alayhi salam went through tremendous life difficulties. One that stands out in my mind is Sayyidina Yaqub. And Sayyidina Yaqub in particular, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions about him that he was still sad. He was mourning Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam years after he had been lost, right? When now they had lost Benjamin, right? Then he's still remembering Sayyidina Yusuf, which is that depression. I wouldn't put that label on it, but he was sad, no doubt. And he was in a heavy state of mourning even years after the fact, right? Sadness doesn't become depression until it debilitates you in life and you're able to function and so on and so forth. We'll try to talk about that a little bit, inshallah. But the point being here that the fact that somebody suffers from a mental illness doesn't mean that they have a lack of iman. Right? That's very important to understand. There is a relationship, a correlation, but it's not a full-blown correlation. It is a medical condition, and thus, like with any other disease, when somebody suffers from a mental illness, there can be cure, there can be treatment. Our Prophet ﷺ said, "Ma anzal Allahu min da'in illa anzala ma'ahu ad-dawa." That there is no affliction that was sent to the human being except that he also sent down with it what? Cure, right? He sent a healing. And so that, of course, applies to this as well. Recovery is always possible, even though there may be no specific and particular cure at any given time for any given illness, but there is always the chance for recovery. So I want to ask you all a couple of questions. What slang terms are used to describe people who suffer from mental illness? What are some, inappropriate kind of terms that are used? Crazy, psycho, somebody said. You gotta speak up, y'all. Abnormal, psychotic. Anything else? Anything else? I'm sorry? Low iman, yes, absolutely. Too sensitive. All of those are realities that play out in many people's lives, right? People who suffer from, any given mental illness condition, but these are terms that are thrown upon on those particular individuals. What are slang terms, or what are terms, or how are people who have cancer described? Somebody who suffers from cancer, what are they described as being, or what state of, I'm sorry? Sick? A fighter? Chronically ill? A survivor? Hasanat are falling. Yeah, that's a very good point. That their sins are, being shed because they're suffering. Look at the difference, right? Look at the difference. They're both conditions that are part of human reality, but look at how we look at them. You understand what I'm saying? A person who suffers from a mental illness may be called, weak, have low iman. They may be called crazy. They may be called even violent. All of these things. But when it comes to somebody who has a particular physical illness, in this case, let's say cancer, they're called what? Somebody who's a survivor, a fighter, somebody who's, doing their best to move through, somebody who we feel bad for them, somebody whose sins are being shed because they're, facing this particular life difficulty. Right? So look at the difference in terms of mindsets, how we look at these two different realities. We need to see them in the same plane. Right? We need to see them in the same plane. In our tradition, in Islam, it's very important to note that from the very earliest of times, our ulama, they understood that various mental health conditions were nothing but that they were illnesses within the realm of the psychological, emotional self, just as you have illnesses within the realm of the physical body. And we understand as Muslims that we are made up of different elements: al-aql, wal-ruh, wal-qalb, wal-nafs. And in other terminologies, the mind, body, spirit, right? And so something that somebody is afflicted by in one of those particular realms, unfortunately, we've kind of made this sort of two world, this opposing worldviews, as we just mentioned a minute ago. But our ulama from very early on, they addressed mental illness and they addressed the psyche of the Muslim and how it can be, how it can suffer just like other parts of the body can suffer. And so I brought this book with me, and anybody who's interested in this field, I absolutely encourage you to pick it up. This book was written, this is a translation, of course. This book, and this is just part of the original work, was written by one of the great scholars of his time, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, who lived in the early 200s, 200 years after the hijrah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the 9th century of the Christian era calendar. So Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, he wrote a book. It's called Masalih al-Abdan wal-Anfus, and they translate as sustenance of the soul. And in this book, he wrote about the different mental illnesses that he witnessed in his time. And it's quite fascinating. And so I'm with the Khalil Center, and one of our directors, Dr. Rania Awad, she's in the San Francisco Bay Area. She wrote a paper on looking at the symptomology that this man over, 1,200 years ago wrote as it relates to the reality of obsessive compulsive disorder, and how he displayed that particular symptomology. And then we look at the books of psychology today, and they almost match up line for line. My point being what? My point being that our ulama approached this issue from long ago, and it wasn't stigmatized even to the way it's been stigmatized even until the recent past, right? Mental illness is kind of an issue. Mental health is an issue that's being discussed on many different levels, on many different platforms, and the stigma is starting to be broken, alhamdulillah. But we broke that 1,200 and perhaps more years ago. The first psychiatric hospital that was set up in the world was set up in the year 705, Christian era. I'm talking, that means what? About 100 years or so after the Hijrah. The first psychiatric hospital was set up in Baghdad, less than 100 years after the passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is incredible, right? And in Cairo 100 years later. So we have a long history of dealing with this particular reality. It wasn't seen as something in the realm as it was with perhaps in other faith traditions, as these are things relating to, demons or issues of weak iman and so on and so forth. So we should not carry that narrative today. Al-Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, one of the great scholars of our ummah, he said something very nice in his masterpiece work, Al-Ihya, Ihya Ulum ad-Din. He said that he talked about how somebody should approach life. And he said that إِذَا أَرَادَ اللَّهُ بِعَبْدٍ خَيْرًا بَصَّرَهُ بِعُيُوبِ نَفْسِهِ. That when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants something good for one of his servants, he makes visible to him, he shows him the faults and the flaws and the shortcomings within himself. And he says, and there's different ways to approach this. And the best way to approach it is for somebody to have a sheikh, somebody that he can go to and to discuss, life matters, and they can help them pick their life apart and figure out how to make their life better. And he says in absence of, but he says how rare that is. And he's talking about in his time, that somebody, has access to somebody like that. Then he says there's another way, is that وطريق أخرى أن يطلب رفيقا صالحا عالما بأسرار هذا الأمر. And he says that another way is for somebody to have a close companion, a righteous, knowledgeable, close companion that is aware of the secrets of this reality, meaning the secrets in the reality of the realm of psychology and understanding the emotional self, right? So Imam al-Ghazali, he's talking about the importance of seeking help, seeking a professional help from somebody that understands these reality, which is quite incredible. I'm sharing this with you because people think this is a new phenomenon. People think that this is something that the West has somehow uncovered and discovered and is at the forefront of making all of these breakthroughs and in terms of treatment and so on and so forth. Yes, in this time and right now at this point in time, the revival of these realities is we can't deny that. But I want you all to understand the deep-rooted understandings that we have as Muslims from our own tradition as it relates to mental health. Very important for us to understand. And I'm not talking about that sort of understanding where people say, well, if you're feeling down, if you're depressed, well, just go and pray 2 rak'ahs, or go make dua, or you're not reading enough Quran, or whatever it may be. That's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm talking about our ulama in the past talked about seeking professional psychological help so as to be able to deal with these particular realities. Okay. What is a mental disorder? What is a mental disorder? There is an important manual for anybody that works in this field that is kind of the guidebook for understanding, for having laid out all of the different, prevalent disorders that display themselves in people. And this book is called the DSM. The latest version is the 5th version, released in 2014, and it stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And they classify a mental disorder as something being, and I'm going to read, this is a definition, so I'm going to read it out, so just bear with me for a minute. A mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental process underlying mental functioning. Big words. The essence of what they're saying is that when somebody's life is disrupted and disturbed in such a way that their thinking processes, their emotional realities, and then their behavior is dysfunctional on some level. Right? They're not able to function at what is considered, in quote, normal. And mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress in social, occupational, or other important activities. So somebody whose life is greatly affected because of the fact that they are struggling with these particular realities. What are the different sort of diagnoses that exist out there? You know, our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, one of the great dua that he used to make, and he used to make in the morning as a part of his regular regimen, he would say, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazan, wa a'udhu bika min al-ajzi wal-kasal, wa a'udhu bika min al-jubni wal-bukhl, wa a'udhu bika min ghalabati ad-dayni wa qahri al-rijal. Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from these 8 things. I'm just going to mention the first 2 because this is what I want to focus on. Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from al-ham wal-hazan. Al-ham, in the Arabic word, there's 2 primary words that are used to describe anxiety. One is ham, the other is gham. Ham is to be anxious for something that you know what the source of that anxiety, where it comes from, right? Like somebody may be anxious, a mom is anxious because her daughter is getting older and like ain't nobody, stepped forward yet, right? She's anxious, right? And you know what that's related towards. Or the other word used primarily in Arabic, al-gham. Al-gham is for something that you don't know what the source of that is, right? What are clouds called in Arabic? Al-ghumum, right? It's cloudy, it's foggy, you don't know what's going on. You don't know why you're anxious. It's an anxiety that's just sitting there. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from al-ham, from anxiety, and al-hazan. Al-hazan is what? Sadness, depression. So, and this is very incredible. The Prophet ﷺ, he made dua seeking protection from the 2 most prevalent mental illnesses that afflict humanity today. And he did that back then. So somebody who says, well, mental health and mental illness, these are new things and those things didn't exist. People used to have strong iman and those, there was no such thing. No. The Prophet ﷺ, he used to make dua seeking Allah's assistance so that he could be protected. And of course, he's teaching us. And these 2 particular things, listen to this. The 2 most common mental health disorders in America today, number 1, anxiety, number 2, depression. And then that's the order in which he mentioned. 50 million people in America, more or less, have some sort of anxiety that has some level of impact in their life, from moderate to significant impact in their life, where it debilitates them somehow in their life. And then about 25 million people who suffer from depression. So subhanAllah, look at the Prophet ﷺ, spoke to that reality way back then. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says in the Quran, one of the most common descriptions of Jannah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, La khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun. That in Jannah, people will not be afraid, they will not be fearful, they will not be anxious. Anxiety comes from what? From something that is going to happen, you're not sure what's going to happen. So you're anxious. So in Jannah, people will not be afraid, they won't be anxious of things that are come, and they won't be sad for things that happened. You're enjoying every single moment in the present right now to its fullest, right? Your mind is here. You're able to be present. You're able to have this mindfulness to what's happening right now. You're not occupied by what's there or what's there, right? And this is the Quranic description of Jannah. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to experience that in this life, right? We're trying to also find peace in this life. So those are the two most common, anxiety and depression. Also, we have some of the other common mental disorders that people struggle with. Bipolar, which has different forms, but the essence of it is that people have highs and they have lows, right? They have periods of mania when they can become extremely active, become extremely productive even, but then times when they crash, right? And will fall into a depression. People who suffer from various obsessive compulsive and related disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, substance use disorders, alcohol and drug use are a big reality today, right? One of the sad realities of today is the issue of marijuana. Marijuana in this country is going towards being, complete legalization. And some Muslims, and part of that is good in the sense that this has to do with the decriminalizing the use of marijuana and its disproportionate use or disproportionate effect, the way in which it disproportionately affects people of color and how they're criminalized because of their use, whereas primarily white people are not afflicted in the same way. So that's one positive, but the absolute negative downside of it is that it's become absolutely normalized and absolutely accepted, and there's differences in the data out there in terms of what the long-term effects are of marijuana. But having dealt with this field a long time, it's known that marijuana decreases your motivation, decreases your drive, and has impact on memory, and so on and so forth. And then eating disorders, and then what we call a dual diagnosis, co-occurring diagnosis, when somebody who has maybe an alcohol or drug problem and they suffer from depression and they suffer from anxiety or whatever it may be. So those are kind of all of those things exist in the Muslim community. All of those things, these are human conditions. These are not things that are specific to any particular people, and other people are absolved of having to deal with them just because, mashallah, we're Muslims. Because we're Muslims, we're like everybody else in this world, and we have the struggles that other people have as it relates to the realities of mental health. So one of the big challenges with mental health, as we mentioned in the beginning, was that one of the big challenges, and by the way, before I go into that, a really quick glimpse into the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and some of the things that we saw in the Sunnah. I'm currently working on a book on 40 hadith as it relates to mental health, and so I'm doing some research, and subhanAllah, my feeling on this issue as it relates to what we see in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that this was an issue that was prevalent, and some people ask, well, did we see anything in the life of the Prophet ﷺ? Are there some examples? There's numerous examples. And my argument would be that this was a daily reality the Prophet ﷺ, he encountered with the people that he counseled and interacted with. So I'm going to run you through a few quick examples of that. So as it relates to, for example, obsessive compulsive thinking, our Prophet ﷺ, he talked about that the shaitan will come to one of you and he will say, who created this and who created that? Until shaitan asks him, who created your Lord? In other words, he's going to take you down this line of thinking until the person asks, well, who created your Lord? Whoever reaches this point that they should seek refuge in Allah and refrain from continuing to think in that way. But some people's mind works that way and they get caught in these obsessive thinking patterns. So there's a reference there in terms of that. We the famous hadith of the three men who come to the Prophet ﷺ and they said, they said that, who are we compared to the Prophet ﷺ? So one of them says, I'm going to fast all day and I'm never going to marry. Another says, I'm going to pray all night. Another says that I'm going to, what did the third one say? He said, I'm never going to marry women, right? So they went into this, and it's hard to say from just looking at this one glance, was that that was their nature, or that was just kind of an immediate sort of glimpse in time, and they were able to absolve themselves. But some people are stuck in those thinking patterns that they're going to do this and they're going to keep doing it and they're going to keep doing it. We have the example of the Prophet ﷺ, when one of the companions comes to him and says, we find ourselves contemplating thoughts that are too terrible to speak of. We would rather have the sky crash down upon us and the earth crumble around us than speak of these matters. In other words, they were thinking about things that really troubled them and they couldn't stop, and this person couldn't stop thinking of them. The Prophet ﷺ, he asked, do you really have such thoughts? And they says, yes. The Prophet ﷺ, he says, ذَلِكَ مَحْضُ الْإِيمَانِ. He says, that is pure faith. In other words, he didn't on any level stigmatize it. In fact, the exact opposite. He said, if you're having those thoughts, but you're fighting them back, you're pushing them back, right? And you're not acting upon them, that is pure faith. That's what we are required to do. So it's beautiful when you look at the prophetic perspective of people who dealt with these realities. Then we look at, the issue of, there was a man in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, he migrated with Tufail ibn Amr to Medina. And this man, he's not named, like a lot of people when they first went to Medina, they weren't happy, they didn't like it, they were homesick. And he became sick, he suffered from anxiety. He took some of his arrowheads, he actually was cutting his fingers. He was cutting, right? Something that's very prevalent today. Cutting the joints of his fingers. And his hands bled out until he died. Because of the cutting that he did with his own hands. And I don't want to get too much into that, the reality of cutting, we don't have time. But the point is he engaged in it. And the man said, Abu Tufail, he saw this man in his dream, right? As often happened with the righteous, they would see somebody who passed in their dream, and they say, what has Allah done with you? And he says, the man says, Allah has forgiven me due to me making hijrah with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's no stigma. There's an important point here. Tufail, he says, why do I see your hands covered? He saw the man in his image, in his dream. Why do I see your hands covered? And he says, the man says, I was told that the man who is in Jannah now, he says, I was told that we would not repair what you have yourself ruined. In other words, your hands, you lost that. You made it to Jannah, but since you destroyed this, that's not there for you. And so Tufail, he relates the story to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Prophet said, "Oh Allah, and for his hands forgive him." He made dua for him, right? He didn't put this. Now this is different than the issue of suicide. Somebody who's taking their own life at their own hands. He cut to the point where he bled out and he died. He wasn't trying to kill himself. That's a different issue, but the issue of suicide is also very important. There are some narrations of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself that are very disputed narrations in terms of their authenticity. That the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam himself, at the very early part of the message, that he was so distraught, the fact that the wahi came to him, the revelation came to him, but then it stopped. And he thought he was going crazy, and it says that he would climb to the top of the mountain and think of him throwing himself off of the mountain. Now, these are disputed accounts. The scholars argue about these matters heavily, but there may be some indication that even the Prophet ﷺ went into a certain mindset, perhaps, wallahu alam. There's issues that also in the Sunnah about people who would drink, and the man who was brought to the Prophet ﷺ, and he was punished as a result, and then he was somebody started to curse the man, and the Prophet ﷺ says, "Don't help shaitan over your brother. Don't kick a man while he's down." Right? So in all of these instances, you see the Prophet ﷺ completely destigmatizing this particular issue. But the reality is we do have stigma in the community surrounding mental health. What are some of those reasons? What are the barriers to people actually seeking out help for mental health related issues in the Muslim community? Anybody? I'm sorry? Culture? What does that mean, culture? People are worried about their family reputation. Our such and such in our family is sick, and what are people going to say about us? What else? Fear of being judged. They're just kind of somehow have some false hope that is somehow just going to vanish, right? Even though it's been there for years, right? What else? No insurance, right? Financial realities. People can't afford to get treatment sometimes, right? So there's all of these things. Some people who are in denial, right? And people come to me sometimes, they say, "Well, Shaykh, is there any kind of, can give us a dua? What surah should we be reading to the Quran because our such and such has been suffering with such and such?" I said, "And how long has he been going through?" "Oh, about 3 years." "So you want me to give you some magic words that I'm going to say and it's automatically going to flip, what they're going through?" Not that we remove iman and dua and seeking Allah's help from the equation. That's an absolutely important part of the equation. But we also have to take other means by which to deal with our realities, right? So these are all things that exist. And the impact of this stigma is real, right? It isolates people. We've had people in our, in the community where I'm at and other places where I've served, who've taken their life, young people who've OD'd on whatever substance, and nobody in the community knows, right? I'll find out. I'm the imam and I'll find out. But then what happens? The people that are supposed to be their closest support, sometimes even their own family members, they're just given some bogus story. "Oh yeah, poor guy, he just passed away in his sleep." How does that 18-year-old, who's fully fit, and how does that happen multiple times in the community? If in your community, when there are young people who die between the age of 15 and into their 20s, and somehow they just magically die in their sleep, or something of that sort, 90% of the time there was an issue as it relates to drugs, alcohol, ODing on some substance, or somebody who themselves took their own life. And we have to keep that in mind. And it's important that we discuss these things openly and overtly. I didn't have time, to talk about where does mental illness come from. It does, and I'll just say this in brief, just for the purpose of saying that I'm going to open up to questions, inshallah. I want to give you all plenty of time. It's a combination of realities, right? There's biological realities. There is, social and environmental realities. There's psychological risk factors that are there. Those all play into why mental health disorders exist. And very, very briefly, the biological risk factors, there are genetic realities in terms of depression, that people who have a family history of depression can also be more prone to that. It's in the genes. Somebody who has prenatal exposure to drugs or other toxins, people who have chronic and high stress, people who have a history in their family of substance abuse. The psychological risk factors can go back to parental neglect and abuse when people were young. People who had long-term separations from their parents, love that was withheld, that was a human need from when they were young, it was withheld, and that had an impact upon them growing up. People who learned dysfunctional behaviors and attitudes and belief towards dealing with life's difficulties, those are also psychological risk factors. And then some of the other social and environmental stressors and risk factors that contribute to mental health within people are poverty, people who live in a unsafe neighborhood, lack of access to health care, and so forth. There's a lot more, that needs to be talked about regarding this issue, but I'm going to stop here, open up for questions, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us understanding.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. How do I distinguish between healthy guilt and self-blame?
How do I distinguish between healthy guilt and self-blame? That's a very good question. Bismillah. Guilt is a part of the human condition, and like it was framed in the question, it can be a healthy, I want to sit here so people can see me. It can be something that is beneficial. One of the stages of growth for the human being is we have the nafs is of different types. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala classified the nafs into 3 types in the Quran. An-nafsul ammara bis-su, right? The nafs that commands a person to do evil things. In the next level up, an-nafsul lawama, the nafs that rebukes itself when it does bad things. So it still falls into sin sometimes, but then it checks itself, right? And so that can be a good thing, of course. But it can be a negative reality if it is something that overtakes a person's thinking. And we are taught in our deen, just like Sayyiduna Adam alayhi salam, when he committed sin, what did he do? He went back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. Right? He made this dua, or our Lord, we have wronged ourselves, and and if you are not merciful upon us and you don't forgive us, then we're going to be from those people that are lost. So when we do something wrong, we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we ask Him for forgiveness, and we move on. But when you get caught in that dwelling part of, man, like I'm doing bad, and Allah's going to punish me, and oh my God, what's going to happen, and I'm not any good, I'm not worth it, why did I even do this? And you get caught into that cycle of thinking, then be careful, right? Then it's that point in time where you may need to share with somebody what's going on with you, because that's the line. We have when we do wrong, we turn to Allah, we ask His forgiveness, and we move on. But when you get stuck and you overly think things, that's the point where you want to be careful and perhaps if there's a need to seek counsel with somebody.
How do you deal with toxic family members that affect your mental health, but you live with them?
Yeah. Bismillah. At the end of the day, we all have control over what we have control over. And so we have to always do the absolute best that we can do within the sphere of influence that we have. And that becomes extremely challenging if there are individuals within our family who display very negative, kind of coping mechanisms in terms of how they deal with life. Something goes wrong and they freak out, or they yell, or they scream, or they curse, or they question Allah, or all of these different things. And that can be very impactful upon us, especially if those people are our parents or people who have some sort of authority over us. So it's very, very important, that we take care of ourselves, and here this is obviously a place where dua is very important, because you're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help you and to cope and be strong. Now, having said that, if that other person in your family who's displaying that toxic behavior, whatever that may be, if that person themselves is struggling from some sort of mental health disorder, then that's a different story. And the reason why I say that is because here there needs to be understanding. Here there needs to be understanding. And instead of looking at their behavior as, man, what's wrong? Why do they always do this? What's wrong with them? They're making my life a living hell. Well, if you understand that they may be they may be somebody who's suffering from depression or anxiety or obsessive compulsive thinking or whatever it is, then that opens up the door for compassion, right? And you know what? SubhanAllah. When the Prophet ﷺ, he taught us, when we see somebody else afflicted with something, what do we say? Alhamdulillah alladhi afani mimma ibtuliya bih, or mimma ibtalak. Oh Allah, I seek, I seek from you, wellness and wholeness, and that I want to have afiyah. Oh Allah, give me afiyah, and thank you for not afflicting me with what that person has been afflicted with. Not from a standpoint of you're saying, thank God I don't have that. No. I'm thankful for what the gifts that you have given me, Ya Allah. And one of the narrations of this hadith says that the person who makes that dua, they will never be afflicted with that particular thing. And then you're supposed to look at that person with an eye of compassion, right? So it depends on the situation as to what's going on with that other person and then how you look at it. But understand that there may be some serious things going on in that person's world, and that can make you completely twist the frame of how you're approaching the whole issue. Wallahu a'lam.
What was the name of the book you mentioned, and is it for sale?
It's called Sustenance for the Soul, Abu Zayd al-Balkhi, and it's online, you can find it. If you go to the Khalil Center website, Khalil Center is spelled KHALILCENTER.com. There's a section there with resources. And some of the leadership at Khalil Center, there are some of national authorities on Muslim mental health, Islamic psychology, and there's a lot of works that are there, articles, references to books, and so on. So anybody who's interested in learning more and studying more and maybe even thinking about going into the field of psychology, social work, marriage, family therapy, etc., there's some amazing references there, and I would highly encourage you to look up the website and see how you could benefit. By the way, speaking of that, I was asked to also kind of point out resources that are there. Khalil Center is the organization that I work with. We're the largest provider of Muslim mental health services in the nation. We have, I think, 9 offices. We started here in Chicago, and then there's 3 offices, I believe, in the Chicagoland area. There's 3 offices in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm the director at the LA office, and we have an office in New York and in Toronto. And we pride ourselves on doing what we call traditional Islamically integrated psychotherapy. In other words, Islam is a part of the healing process. And it has to be a part of the healing process, because only when you have the spiritual self is full, along with the, once you're emotionally repair and you're able to psychologically repair, we also want to make sure that we are also spiritually whole as well. And so that's part of what we do and how we incorporate that. A couple other websites. There's what's called the I think you have it there. Maybe, I'm not sure. Maybe I'll find it. But there's one of them is called NAMI, National Association for Mental Illness, NAMI.com, I believe. It's a great resource for people who need help with members of their family who are struggling with mental health and to get help. And there's another resource called SAMSA, I think it's SAMSHA.com. And it's a national website that has a tremendous amount of resources for people who are looking for help.
As a mentor, many youth ask us how they can cope with depression. What is the right way to help them? Should we bring up an Islamic perspective?
Yeah, very good question. For those of you that work with other people, it's important to get a little bit more of training, a little more training on terms of the realities. Anybody who works as a youth director, as an imam, a community leader, a school teacher, a principal, administrator, anybody who has a public, that you work with, there's some things that you should understand about mental health a little bit more than what we talked about today. So I would encourage you all to look to take a kind of a mental health. We at Khalil Center, we offer a mental health first responders training. And so if anybody's interested in bringing it to their city where they're at, we can talk about that and help make that happen. And basically we train imams, we train other community leaders to help to help them understand the signs of depression, of anxiety, and this and that. So when people display with certain things, well, what can you do next? What is your role? And your role is very important. And I'm not going to tell you simply, well, no, you just need to refer them out to a psychologist or a therapist or whatever it may be. The imam has a very important role to play in this. People want to hear from their spiritual leader. Now, the spiritual leader, the imam, needs to know their limits, but they do need to encourage them. And they do also need to ensure that they get them to the next step. And so imams and other community leaders in you should know who the qualified people are in your community that can help provide that service. So you do want to encourage them, you do want to hold their hand, you do want to follow up with them. If you see certain signs of certain things going on, hey, I know that we've talked about this before, and I encourage you to seek help. What have you done, right? So those are some things that hopefully help, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair.